He looks down, he makes changes in his life. Let me give you another anecdote. Lady decides to join the cycling group at work. She hasn't been on a bicycle in years. She's riding her bicycle. And by the way, she's type 2 diabetic. In fact, she maxed out on the pills, and she's now injecting as well. Over time, through cycling with the group at work and outside of work, she is now on one pill a day, and some days she doesn't have to inject at all. Why? Because she got a little bit more active. So there's anecdotal evidence that workplace programs work because both of those examples are from a real workplace and from real people who made decisions based on having a workplace wellness program in their workplace. Is the workplace the place where health should happen, though? Well, when you think about it, anybody who's got a full-time job probably works anywhere from 7 to 10 hours a day, every day, at work, and then they have some sleep time, so that doesn't leave a whole lot of other time for health. If you're a university student, you're probably working 14 hours a day. Yeah? There's another more compelling reason why the workplace is the right place for health and for health information. This is some research that was done by Shauna Burke and her colleagues, and what this suggests is that the effect size is greater for what we call a true group. Now, a true group is people who interact with each other, like colleagues at work, like friends, and so on. And for any of you who have ever tried to go on a diet, tried to get on an exercise regime by yourself, it is just about impossible. But when you've got peer support, and if that peer support is with you 7 hours a day or 8 hours a day at work, then it becomes a whole lot easier. And quite clearly from Professor Burke's work and colleagues, we can see that having that true group supporting you in health makes a big difference. Let me tell you about a research project that we started. This is we started actually way back in 2011 was when the idea for this project first started. The idea behind it was that we couldn't find evidence for workplace wellness programs' effectiveness. There was lots of anecdotal work. There was lots of kind of pre-test, post-test. You know, we put in a wellness program at time 1, and at the end of 4 years, we've got all of these, decrease in drug costs. We've got improvement in people's health and so on. That, however, is not evidence from a scientific point of view, and you all know that there's kind of a hierarchy in terms of evidence. Yeah, a randomized control trial is at the top. Right? Then you kind of work your way down, and way down near the middle is kind of pre-test, post-test, and way down at the bottom is anecdote in terms of what we consider to be evidence in science. And so we wanted to go in and do the best study we possibly could in terms of trying to find the evidence for workplace wellness programs. The best we could do was a treatment control group study across time. We couldn't do a randomized control trial because quite clearly the companies had to volunteer to put in a wellness program in their organizations. The employees in the treatment group, they had to volunteer to be a part of the wellness program. Even the control group, they had to volunteer to be part of the control group and to fill out surveys and so on. So this isn't a randomized control trial, but this is kind of the best that we could do. And by the way, this is what a 2-year study looks like. Yeah, it's like 6 years already, and we're probably going to be having outputs for a few more years after that. You can see from this that it was in 2 phases. Phase 1, we did a meta-analysis. I'm going to talk very briefly about that. Phase 2 is this kind of treatment and control group study, and we've only just finished that this summer. And so some of the data that I'm going to be talking to you about now is that recent. Like, it isn't even in press. I was going to say hot off the press, but it isn't even gone to press yet, right? We're just trying to get the information out as quickly as we possibly can without jeopardizing our position to our ability to publish the work at a later date. Let's talk about the meta-analysis. You already heard earlier today from Shane about Cochrane reviews. Let me tell you, a meta-analysis is probably the biggest idea in the last 100 years. Meta-analyses have saved more lives than people you will meet in your entire lifetime. What a meta-analysis does is it takes a whole bunch of different studies that meet a certain level of rigor. It pulls them all together as if they were a single study, and now you've got much more statistical power. Yeah, now you can get much stronger, much more significant correlations, and so that's what you do with a meta-analysis. So we did a meta-analysis on all of the research that was done. We started out, we wanted to find all the research that was done in Canada, all the credible research, with at least a treatment and control group. We found none. So then we said, okay, well, let's relax our eligibility criteria and let's do treatment and comparison group. We found none. Lots of pre-test, post-test, but now we're getting too low in the scale in terms of what would qualify as evidence for us. So then we said, okay, there's no Canadian work. There's some really good work done in the US, but no Canadian work. So let's do the whole rest of the world, published in English, except for the US, because that work's already been done, most notably by Baker and colleagues from Harvard. And these are the results that we got. You can save 14 to 36% absenteeism if you have a wellness program. We looked at some 504 papers. You know how many we got that were rigorous enough we could actually use in our meta-analysis? 4. Yeah, 4. I was so depressed. Yeah, I remember walking to the meeting. I said, "We got 4 papers." And one of my colleagues who's on the research team, Professor Greg Zarek, said, you know what? He's a health economist. He said, in my space, 4 is good. And I said, excellent, we'll go for it. So we did the 4. These are the results that we've got. You can save 1.5 to 1.7 days worth of absenteeism on average if you put in a workplace wellness program. What that means for Canadian businesses, $3.6 billion in absenteeism alone if you put in a wellness program. Now, there's another thing to be thinking about in terms of absence. When we're talking about absence, what they're calculating is what we're paying the employee for doing no work because they're not here. The true value of that employee is their productive value. What's the multiple? The reason they're paying you 20 bucks an hour is because you're worth 50. So that's the number you should be going for. Yeah? So now do a multiple on that 3.6 billion and you can see what absenteeism is costing the Canadian economy every year. And that's just absenteeism. Never mind all the other human costs. Okay, so that was the start. And absenteeism was all we could talk about. All of those studies all over the world, and the only conclusion we could come to for which we had data was about absenteeism. Nothing about reduced drug costs, nothing about improved health, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously there was room for our study. Here's what our study looks like. We have a treatment group, and the treatment group and the control groups are both exactly the same company, but they're geographically distinct. So the treatment group is in one building in one city. The control group is the same company, but in another building in another city, or maybe they're out in the field. And the reason why we did this is because we want to control for a host of variables. We want to control for the policy space, some organizational culture, the suppliers, the buyers, the industry, right? We want to be able to control, because in the end, we want to compare the treatment group to the control group, and we want to be able to say with some kind of certainty that the difference we're seeing is not a function of things outside of the organization, but they're a function of the wellness program itself. And that's important to be able to do that. And frankly, that hasn't been done before. So we actually have our control groups divided in 2. We've got one group of controls get the survey, because we want to compare the treatment control groups, so we need the survey data. The other set of control groups has the survey as well as biometric screening clinics. Now, we know that by surveying people, and especially by giving them biometric screening clinics, we are shrinking that magnitude of effect, right, between the treatment group and the control group. Why? Because if you do anything for your people, they will respond positively. That's called, in business, we call that the Hawthorne Effect, right? And it's from a General Electric study where they turned up the lights to see if employees would work harder, and they did. And they thought, wow, this is really cool. Let's go write it up. So they turned the lights down as they left, and guess what? People worked harder. It had nothing to do with the lights. It was the fact that you actually did something for your people, right? That's what makes the difference. So we know that people respond, right, to being surveyed. So just by surveying them, just by giving them biometric screening clinics, we knew we would be changing their behaviors. And by the way, we purposely changed some behaviors. So for example, we had people in a control group where we had them at the biometric screening clinic, and we had to say to them, look, we are not doing a diagnosis. It was a registered nurse that was actually doing the clinic. We're not doing a diagnosis, but, take this piece of paper, take these numbers, and please, please, please go see your doctor. So we were already changing people's health behaviors. Well, frankly, that was the ethical thing to do, and you all would have done the same, I'm sure. This is what the study looks like across Canada. We had, sadly, nobody from Eastern Canada, but we had all the other provinces represented, and the topography actually represents the number of participants we had. We had 6 companies, 28 sites, 840 people participate. Actually, 804 actually signed consent forms. We had a really good selection of industries. We had a really good selection of job categories. So we had managers, executives, we had salespeople, et cetera, et cetera. So this isn't purely representative of a Canadian. If it was a randomized control trial, it would be much more representative of Canada. But we're pretty close. We're pretty close. We're pretty close in terms of age. We're pretty close in terms of body mass index, for example. So it's reasonable, and we're pretty happy with it, and fairly confident that our results will be reasonably generalizable, certainly in a Canadian context. One of the things that we developed as part of the wellness program is we developed this index. And on the far right-hand side, we have a whole series of survey question items that feed into all of these subcomponents. Now, the survey questions that feed into those subcomponents are all behavioral questions, not perception questions. And that's really important, and that makes a difference. Because we ran the correlations between people's perceptions of their health and the numbers that we got from the biometric screening, and there's zero correlation. Zero correlation. People's perceptions of themselves aren't the same as themselves. I mean, my perception of myself when I look in the mirror, I love to cycle, yeah? So when I look in, I'm a mammal, by the way, middle-aged man in lycra, yeah? Okay? So, and I know you're all picturing it in your mind, right? So I look in the mirror and I see Chris Froome, right? The winner of the Tour de France, or Ryder Hagedal, you know, the Canadian who won the Giro d'Italia a couple of years ago. When you guys look at me, you're probably saying, oh, geez, look at that fat guy, fat old guy, yeah? Okay, so perception is totally different from the reality. And that's exactly what we found with people's perceptions of their health. Now, all of these subcomponents feed into these components here, and these components are all weighted from the literature. So 44% is for culture and engagement, 22% for stress. And by the way, when executives are surveyed about the most important elements in their business, they talk about engagement and they talk about stress. Yeah, and so it's no wonder that these numbers came up the way they did. And then based on this weighting, they all feed into this organizational wellness index. The reason we developed this index is so that people could see where they stood at one point in time with their organization, what their score was, if you like, a report card, and then they could do it again 6 months later or a year later. Yeah, and they could see whether they're improving or whether they're not, and be able to take remedial action. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the results from this wellness index, and then I'm going to talk about a couple other things that we've got come out of the research so far. This is what we've got so far. This is wellness index stuff, and if you look at the overall wellness index, yeah, this is the treatment group, 6.8 points improvement. This is the control group, 2.7. Now remember, both of those control groups are actually increased because we're surveying them, and especially for the ones that got both the survey and the biometric screening, because a lot of people change their behaviors because they got screened. But even if that wasn't the case, this is amazing. This is totally cool. Yeah. Now let's look at some of these other numbers. Some of the stuff we know about addiction, alcohol and tobacco, for example, that we heard this morning already. Yeah, very difficult to change those. And this was a 2-year study, and we saw zero improvement in the treatment group and a little bit of a decrease in the control group. If we look at stress, that's pretty nice. We were pretty happy to see that. Yeah, that is a significant improvement over the control group. If you look over here at culture and engagement, nutrition, basically about the same. I mean, everybody's being bombarded. I mean, bacon's not good for you, milk's not good for you, don't drink too much water. Okay, so you know, we're bombarded with nutrition, so it's no wonder that these two are the same. But look at this. The increase in physical activity. I get all goosebumpy when I see that. I mean, that is absolutely remarkable. One of the things that we know is the very famous study by Booth et al. They claim that the single most important intervention that they can think of to improve some 17 health risk factors is exercise. You've all heard of sitting disease, which is becoming really popular now. You're not supposed to sit more than an hour without getting up and moving around. Yeah, well, wow, look at the impact we're having here. For early indications, this is looking pretty nice. In terms of health, now remember, you have to have a health case and a business case. I feel so sorry for people who want to get a workplace wellness program in their organization, whether it's a business or a not-for-profit or a government department or whatever, because they got a tough row to hoe. You have to walk in and say, okay, it's going to improve people's health. Yeah? And And then the chief finance officer says, but will there be a return on investment, or is this going to cost? Where's the evidence that it works, and how much is this going to cost us? And right now, frankly, as you heard earlier, there is no evidence. So we're hoping that some of the evidence that we're producing here will help people as they go into the boardrooms for that critical meeting with the finance officer to say, you know what, not only is it better for people's health, but there's a business case too. So this is a good argument for the health case, and we've seen that there's a good argument for the business case just from the savings and absenteeism alone. This is a little bit small for you to read, but there's a couple things I want to flag up for you here. Number one is the perception of a lack of healthy food choices. That's come down by 6 points. Lack of knowledge has come down. You can read as well as I can. 7 points, 8 points, 8 points. The excuses are falling away over 2 years. Yeah? And so people are getting more information. They're becoming more motivated. And there's one other really interesting finding here that we hadn't expected, and that's this one. It's going the wrong way after 2 years. Yeah? Top line is baseline, the next line is 2 years later, and look at that, it's got worse by 6 points, and that's lack of support at home. So we thought about that for a while, and we thought, you know what, that actually makes sense. His dad's at work, and he's getting some information about health, and he comes home and he says, kids, no macaroni, cheese, and a hot dog tonight, we're having fish and a salad. Yeah, you're going to get pushback at home, yeah, when you're starting to change habits. And so if we want workplace wellness programs to be successful when we implement them, not only do we have to do all of the things that we know we need to do about any kind of a change thing, get management on board, set up the processes, make sure the structure's right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but we've got to make sure we help our employees understand how to deal with their families. Because what we really, really want is we want wellness to help the family, help the employee. We want it to go back and feed into their families and into our communities. If we can do that, then we're onto something. My message today is that wellness works. It's good for people. It's good for business. It's good for our communities. It's good for our health budgets. It's good for population health. It's good for government. This is win-win. Wellness is an idea worth spreading.